Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Hashim Kumar. As European leaders gather in Paris for an emergency summit on Ukraine, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has signalled a major shift, expressing willingness to deploy British troops to Ukraine to help secure a potential peace deal. With other European nations also considering similar commitments, questions arise about the implications for regional security and NATO's role. Well, to analyse this pivotal moment, we turn to Professor Scott Lucas of University College Dublin for expert insight on the UK's position and the risks of European-led peacekeeping efforts. Professor Lucas, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me here.
I'd like to kick off, please, with very briefly, if you could share your key takeaways from the Munich Security Conference, which has just ended.
I think the key takeaway is this is the most important moment for Europe as a continent, certainly since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Arguably since 1945, because the difference between 1945 is that the U.S. and European countries were fighting alongside each other against the threat of Nazi Germany, of Italian fascism. In this case, Europe can no longer count on the current U.S. government under Donald Trump. I think until the Munich Security Conference, there was still a lingering hope that you could flatter Trump, that you could reach out to people around Trump, and that you could emphasize the specific importance of defending Ukraine and the wider importance of European security. But what Europe realized is this isn't just a Trump problem. This is a problem of J.D. Vance, the vice president. It's a problem of other advisors, and it's a fundamental problem that, as the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said in his confirmation hearings a few weeks ago, these people do not believe in the post-war international order. We can go into specifics on this. We can talk about the level of expenditure within NATO. We can talk about cooperation over Ukraine. We can talk about the question of tariffs versus economic cooperation. But the fundamental here is I don't believe there is now an alliance between the U.S. government and European partners.
So what is then the response that Europe should take? I mean, we know that European leaders are meeting in Paris at the invitation of President Macron. What's on the table there? What's on the agenda and what outcomes do you expect?
Well, the starting point is just the symbolism of you hang together or you hang separately. Europe cannot afford to be divided. It cannot be afford to be quarreling amongst itself. There has to be a drive amongst most of its members that now don't think it in terms of a European Union army and things like that, but think about it in terms of European cooperation on military assistance, on military production, on cyber defense, on defense against disinformation efforts, on maritime security. Think of it in terms of cooperation on economic security, on helping out weaker members who might be in trouble and not have, a quarrel amongst yourselves where the rich gets richer, the poor get poor. Think about it in terms of diplomatic cooperation. Now, there will be outliers here, as we've seen in the responses to the summit in Paris today. We know that Viktor Orban's Hungary will stand to the side. We know that Robert Fico's Slovakia will stand to the side. But most European countries now have to step up to the mark, not in terms of percentage of GDP spent on defense, but in terms of organization, cooperation, and implementation of plans.
So some kind of integrated infrastructure in terms of both military and economic development within the EU. But right now, the conversation certainly around Ukraine is around the military aspects of it. So peace talks, peace negotiations, which have been kicked off in Saudi Arabia, and talks of some kind of peacekeeping force. And Keir Starmer has already said that he'd be prepared to send 10,000 British troops to Ukraine. What is your view on the likelihood of some kind of peace agreement being reached, and B, whether European peacekeeping troops should be sent out, including UK troops?
There won't be a peace agreement. I mean, there will be a question of whether or not Ukraine is forced to capitulate to Russia. I mean, let's be honest here. What you have is Donald Trump looking to reach a grand agreement with Vladimir Putin, and the Kremlin, as was restated by Sergei Lavrov yesterday, is not going to make any concessions on its occupation of more than a quarter of Ukraine. It doesn't want Europe at the talks whatsoever. I suspect it's not going to allow Ukraine or accept Ukraine having any type of security guarantees. So that's your question. It's whether or not you have a capitulation to Russia. It's not a question of a peace agreement at this point, which is why, and this is strange, that headline issue of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine for the moment is more of a symbolic rather than a real issue. Until you get a functioning agreement, you don't bring in peacekeeping forces. But what is symbolic is it is symbolic, for example, that the UK, which had isolated itself from Europe, which until very recently was actually bending towards the Trump administration, has all of a sudden come back the other way, and at least symbolized through that statement by Keir Starmer, we recognize the necessity of military cooperation with EU states. That's the importance of that. And individual states will be important in terms of how they position themselves on that issue, but in terms of a wider significance. So, for example, Sweden, one of the newer members of NATO, Norway have come in and said, yes, we would commit troops. Well, that's a signal of military cooperation. Poland has said, we will not commit troops to a peacekeeping force, but we will emphasize military assistance to Ukraine. And as long as the conflict goes on, and if there is a peacekeeping force, we'll provide military assistance as well. And Germany, of course, will say we'll provide military aid to Ukraine, but at no point will we provide peacekeeping troops, because that's part of German history and German politics we can discuss on another program. Right.
So a patchwork of responses. All the countries that you just mentioned are all members of NATO. How would such an exercise actually overlap with their NATO responsibilities? And what happens, if a NATO soldier is killed or injured during his peacekeeping or her peacekeeping work? I mean, is Article 5 triggered?
At this point, again, we're talking about hypotheticals all the way down the road.
We certainly are, yes. It is being discussed.
Well, I think we need to break down on how it's being discussed. And what the question is right now is, let's be realistic here, is what type of security guarantee does Ukraine get if there is not a deal with the Russians? Okay? So in that question is for example, does Ukraine get an invitation to NATO? Now, at this point, it appears that certain states are standing against that, right? Does Ukraine get security guarantees from individual member states of NATO that it will be defended and protected if Russia tries to expand its attacks, expand its zone of occupation? That's the key issue that we're talking about. So will Poland, for example, provide a security guarantee for Ukraine if we talk about the Russians threatening to move out of the Donbass and sweep further to the west? Is that going to happen? Is Germany going to provide those guarantees? Probably not. But are France, Britain going to provide those guarantees? Possibly. And that, I think, is the fundamental question we need to get to, rather than more of the distraction one of just Article 5 in a general sense.
Right. Well, we will be watching what transpires in Paris and also in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Meantime, Professor Lucas, we're going to have to end our conversation here, but do come back soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. And that's all from World Talks. Goodbye.